The social structures which govern our society are based on adherence to collective rules and regulations, an implicit trust in one another, and our acceptance of collective memory. But what happens when trust and memory break down, and when the resulting vacuum is filled by myths and conspiracies?
People are seeking out answers for complex problems, and a conspiracy offers that simple explanation. The argument makes you feel more reassured, more in control. So this is why people are drawn to these conspiracies and need these myths.
Sometimes bizarre and destructive, sometimes simply part of a collective nostalgia. These myths become woven into the fabric of our society and, in some cases, passed down from generation to generation. A common one is the myth that the next generation is less resilient, lazier, and more entitled than those who came before. Completely unironically, without thought for the fact that the same, once upon a time, was probably said about them, depending on the values they held dear.
The kids these days myth is something that happens with every generation of adults. Kids these days are different, they don't understand, they don't work as hard.
And not even experts are safe from buying into this misconception. In one 2017 study, a psychologist looked at 50 years' worth of data, testing children's patience and ability to delay gratification. When hundreds of experts in developmental psychology were asked for a prediction of the result, 84% said they thought the data would show children were performing worse with each passing generation. In fact, the opposite was true. This idea that things were better in the past extends to our general worldview. Writers such as Swedish physician and statistician Hans Rosling have illustrated that in many respects the world is a better place than we think it is. Life expectancy has gone up, global poverty down. Yet we are unaware of these gradual positive changes, clinging to the idea that things were better a generation before. Underpinning the kids these days bias is the flawed way that our brains construct and recollect memories.
Historical revisionism is a very legitimate exercise. New information is discovered, and we have to look at the past in light of that new stuff that we've learned. Nostalgic revisionism is something slightly different, and that is generally where people start to be nostalgic for the old days.
Biased memory mechanisms mean that when adults evaluate the capabilities of children, they invariably compare them to their own abilities as adults. Loaded into this myth is that the good old days means different things to different generations. In comparison to their seniors, the values of today's youth are seen as inconsequential at best and damaging at worst. But now, the tables have been turned, as social media has also given those kids these days, the present generation of children, a platform to turn the myth of the good old days on its head. Playing out through OK Boomer memes, referring to the baby boomer generation born after World War II.
OK Boomer is a great expression. It's a way of saying, okay, I'm tired of hearing the story about how when you were young in the 50s, you were so much better behaved than young people are nowadays who are now coming into adulthood.
OK Boomer memes were also a reaction to inaction on issues like climate change, resistance to socially progressive policies, and condescension towards the youth of today. In more recent times, the nostalgia for the greatness of the past has also manifested in the rhetoric of the 2016 US presidential campaign, with Donald Trump's campaign slogan,
"Make America Great Again."
This, of course, is nostalgic revisionism. And what was so interesting to me while watching that campaign was that the people who were cheering the loudest for stories about how great things were in the 50s, for instance, were people that were born in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, had no idea, right? They have the television version of how things were in the 1950s. So the past that Trump was talking about, they wanted to return America's greatness from that past, is a complete fiction.
The slogan is layered with meaning. For some, it means hope and optimism. For others, it means social regression and a return to a time of greater inequality, hatred, and racism.
I don't recognize the country that Donald Trump describes. I don't recognize the mean-spiritedness, the bigotry, and the blustering.
Restoring the greatness of a nation is a seductive idea, but it's a hollow promise when we realize that the past probably never happened the way we remember it now. And our belief in the comparative greatness of the past is, in fact, nothing more than faulty memory construction.
Philosophers throughout time have put a lot of emphasis on the human capacity for reason. But what we found out as we study human reasoning patterns in the 20th century and the 21st century is that human beings aren't actually all that good at reasoning. And often what we're doing when we form beliefs is believing things that are psychologically healthy for us, that make us happy, that we find beautiful in one way or another, or fun in one way or another. We don't always go where the evidence goes.
When we dispel the rosy glow of nostalgia from our past, there is little empirical evidence to support the idea that it was a better, gentler time. But revisionist history is not purely relegated to an older generation reminiscing about the past. History is being rewritten every day to suit a myriad of worldviews. For hundreds of years, we believed we were the center of the solar system and even the universe. But over time, different cultures replaced a geocentric model with the Earth at the center of the universe with a heliocentric model, with the Earth spinning around the Sun. In Western culture, this shift began with Polish astronomer Copernicus in the early 1500s. Copernicus proposed a model in which the Earth and other planets in our galaxy revolved around the Sun. He didn't formally publish this theory until 1543. The book would eventually be banned by the Catholic Church, but the seed was already planted and wouldn't die. It would be expanded upon by brilliant minds. Among them, Italian astronomer Galileo Galilei, whose observations of other planets in our solar system supported Copernicus's theory. Since we started to explore space in the middle of the 20th century, the evidence for the spherical nature of the Earth and our position revolving around the Sun has mounted. But not everyone is so easily convinced.
Science has made it clear that we are a part of the galaxy as opposed to being the center of the galaxy. And this, for a lot of groups, is quite bothersome, right? It runs counter to a narrative that has us as being the most important creatures, and not just the galaxy, the universe.
Confronted with this reality, there are some who hold on to the idea that the Earth is at the center, but they don't stop there. They also believe that the Earth is flat. Known as flat earthers, they reject scientific evidence that the Earth is a sphere in favor of various versions of the Earth as a flat disk floating in space. There are two particularly prevalent versions of flat Earth theory. The first is that the Earth is a flat disk with a large ice wall at its boundary that holds in the world's oceans. The other is that the Earth is a flat circle under a massive dome that holds in the Earth's atmosphere. There is a prevailing idea that flat Earth theory harks back to the Middle Ages, to a time before scientific enlightenment, the age of exploration. At the end of the 15th century, When Christopher Columbus embarked on his journey to the East Indies, people were afraid he would fall off the edge of the world.
The myth that Christopher Columbus would fall off the edge of the earth, right, as he attempted to sail around it, wasn't a myth that existed during Columbus's time, right? Washington Irving in the early 1800s started that myth. In Columbus's day, in fact, we can go back further, right? In ancient Greek times, plenty of people knew that the earth was spherical, was not flat, right? Pythagoras demonstrated this as well as other mathematicians.
In reality, the flat earth theory, whilst prevalent in the Middle Ages, gathered real momentum in the 1800s, when conservative thinkers hankered for a return to a literal interpretation of the Bible.
The idea that Earth is flat had a bit of a resurgence in the 1900s with a man called Samuel Rowbotham and the Zetic Society. He based his beliefs that the Earth was flat due to a misreading of the Bible and passages within it, which claimed that, indeed, the Earth is flat rather than spherical.
But today, these views are less rooted in religion and more focused on disbelief in established science and authority.
So, of course, a fundamental issue here is distrust in our institutions, distrust in scientists and governments to tell the truth around important facts. So, interestingly, those who are more likely to believe in conspiracies have a desire to want to be unique, to want to be different. And arguably, this conspiracy offers just that.
Far from dying out or being overwhelmed by scientific evidence, the myth of the Earth being flat was reignited in the late 20th century when flat earthers tapped into the internet to create a cult following.
The Flat Earth Society began in the 1950s and then rose to prominence in a limited way in the 1970s, and then kind of exploded, as you might expect, on social media recently.
Its polls suggest 1% or so of the population believe in the flat earth conspiracy theory. Now, on the one hand, that is a small number. But on the other hand, actually, America is a very big place. And if 1% of people are believing in this conspiracy, that potentially actually is quite a lot of people.
To believe the Earth is flat also requires an acceptance of other conspiracy theories and myths. Theories that already prey on those with a conspiracy mindset.
There is no segment of society that's immune from believing in conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are believed by all sorts of people on all sides of political spectrums, from all sorts of backgrounds. But research does show that, first, if you have believed a conspiracy or theory in the past, you're more likely to believe one in the future.
Among the most pervasive conspiracies of the 20th century is the notion that NASA's space exploration missions were all a hoax.
It's one small step for man.
It's far more compatible with flat Earth theory to believe that astronauts were never there in the first place. To some, flat Earth theory is a reflection of our post-truth era, where a lie isn't a lie if you believe it, and where myths grow when facts can be ignored or repositioned to suit an alternative worldview. Our worldview has been shaken by events throughout our history. One such event took place over a century ago on a cold, cloudless night in the mid-Atlantic. On the 15th of April 1912, the RMS Titanic sank in the frigid waters of the Atlantic Ocean. It took over 1,500 lives with it on that fateful evening, and stories of the last hours of the Titanic are told and retold, creating legends to fill the void of such a sad tale. Back in the early 20th century, the Titanic was without peer.
Well, as far as the comparison goes, there was really no comparison back in Titanic's time. It was the largest, most luxurious, and most opulent ship afloat, and that's why everyone, regardless of what class they were in, wanted to be on the ship. The White Star Line sort of uttered the phrase that the Titanic was unsinkable, but they qualified it. And they said the Titanic is either practically unsinkable or almost unsinkable. Well, and obviously we saw that that was not the case. The Titanic was certainly sinkable.
Even the reported damage that led to the ship's sinking became a myth that lasted for decades. Originally, it was thought that the iceberg tore a near 100-meter or 300-foot gash along the side of the hull. The scale of the damage seemed plausible, given the magnitude of the tragedy that followed. But in 1985, the remains of the Titanic were discovered on the ocean floor, allowing for analysis using modern technology. It is now believed that 6 much smaller holes were responsible for sinking the ship in just 2 hours and 40 minutes. In total, the 6 holes in the ship's hull measured only 12 square feet, or 1.1 square meters. It was the unfortunate placement of these holes that led to disaster. The ship was designed to float with 3 to 4 of these holes flooded, but not 6. Over 100 years since the sinking of the Titanic, cinema retellings have contributed to the mythology surrounding the events of that night. One of the most prevalent of which relates to what the band played as the ship sank.
The band playing until the end was an interesting story about Titanic, and it is true. We know that it was true because survivors in lifeboats and in the water who ultimately survived tell us that they heard the band playing until the very end.
In terms of the music the band was playing, a myth persists that the band's last song was a hymn, "Nearer My God to Thee," and a suitably religious final moment to mark a tragic end. Yet accounts from survivors are of the band playing ragtime music and popular songs. Movie dramatizations of the band playing a hymn have led to the myth becoming a fact in popular memory. When writer-director James Cameron was making his 1997 film Titanic, he liked the band scene in the 1958 Titanic film, A Night to Remember, so much that he recreated it, breathing new life into a 40-year-old fictionalization of the story. Even when the tale seems improbable, the legend of Titanic is so strong, some myths are hard to dispute 100 years later.
There's always someone who says, the myth is true, and I know that it's true because somebody told me who was there.
The same also goes for the myth of the third-class passengers being locked below deck to prevent them from overwhelming the lifeboats being commandeered for first and second-class passengers.
The myth of the second and third-class passengers not being able to make it onto the deck of the ship is one of the biggest myths about the Titanic story. And we don't have any evidence, really, of people struggling to get through locked gates, although it is clear that some of the third-class passengers, because they were in the lower levels of the ship, had some difficulty getting up to the deck of the ship and had problems finding the deck of the ship. But intentionally cutting them off, there's no evidence that that occurred.
Social biases are rife throughout the stories told and retold about Titanic, seen now as an attempt to paper over the problems of the existing social and class-based systems. Particularly important during a time of transition from the social structures of the 19th century to the burgeoning social opportunities of the 20th century. This all makes it a rich setting for myth-making and popular storytelling.
We certainly have no shortage of disasters to tell stories about, and to make films about, and to write books about. But there's a lot of sex appeal with Titanic. The fact that it was a microcosm of society, that we had the first and the second and the third class, and that there were separations between them all. The fact that the captain went down with the ship, the band was playing until the end. All these things make for very interesting stories.
Looking back into history with a sense of fascination is a common urge and can often lead to a mythologizing of events, particularly when they seemingly defy rational explanation or understanding. The 1920s in America was a time of social, political, and economic change. Dubbed the Roaring Twenties, it was an era where the incomes of the working class increased as people moved in droves from the country to the city. This influx of population and wealth created an atmosphere of mass consumerism, and credit firms emerged, allowing people to borrow money to fund businesses and buy items they otherwise couldn't afford.
So at the start of the 1920s, the US economy is roaring. It's very, very easy to make a lot of money. There's a lot of optimism. America had exited World War I and did not want to look back.
But the country was charging towards disaster. The Jazz era came to an abrupt end with the stock market crash of October 1929. An event that is both well documented and surrounded by myths.
The stock market crash in 1929 was the result of many, many things. A lot of exuberance, a lot of debt, a lot of irrational investing, speculation, speculation, speculation. And it doesn't match with what's really happening.
The catalyst occurred on the 23rd of October 1929 with a massive unexplained sell of around 6 million shares, most sold at a loss. Overall, there was a $4 billion drop in stock value. The next day, people rushed to sell their shares. Known now as Black Thursday, 12.9 million shares were sold, with a stock value loss around $9 billion. But the final nail in the coffin of the American economy came on Tuesday, the 29th of October.
So in 1929, there's a lot of things that are going on in the stock market, but most people really think of Black Tuesday, which is a day when the market just absolutely plummets.
Stock prices opened at a sharp drop from the day before, and investors began to sell. 3.2 million shares were traded in the first half hour. By midday, it was 8 million. It was a pattern repeated again and again as the market slumped lower and lower.
The New York Stock Exchange is in a panic. Frantic investors have scrambled to unload their stocks at any price. Everyone wants to sell. No one wants to buy.
By the end of that Tuesday, over 16 million shares had been sold. Fortunes invested or even just kept in banks had disappeared in a matter of days. People's lives changed forever. These are the facts surrounding the great stock market crash of 1929. But looking past the facts reveals a cache of myths entangled within this moment in history. A widely held myth was that in the midst of this disaster, a spate of suicides took hold as people succumbed to their despair. A man in Kansas City who shot himself in the chest saying, "Tell the boys I can't pay them what I owe them." A dentist in Chicago who was consumed with guilt after convincing his young assistant and laboratory aide to put their savings into the stock market. A young man in a hotel in Milwaukee who left 4 cents and a note that read, "My body should go to science, my soul to Andrew W. Mellon, and sympathy to my creditors." Mellon was the Secretary of the Treasury at the time. Today, the myth that hundreds of bankers and investors took their own lives by jumping from buildings in Lower Manhattan persists, fueled in part from media reporting at the time. After witnessing Black Thursday, humorist Will Rogers wrote in a nationally syndicated newspaper column, "You had to stand in line to get a window to jump out of." But did people really jump? While there were deaths reported, only 2 were the result of people jumping from buildings as a result of financial distress. Thus, the myth of many distraught bankers throwing themselves from high-rise buildings was simply not true. In actuality, the suicide rate over these months in New York City was lower than in the previous years. But the suffering was real. On the heels of the economic crash of '29, America tumbled into the Great Depression, leading to another myth which saw the stock market crash and the Great Depression seemingly intertwined.
So in the 1930s, you have really deep and wide depression in the United States. People are struggling for work, people's savings are wiped out, a lot of people lost everything they had overnight, and it's a really, really hard time. You know, I think a lot of people are questioning the American dream itself and what capitalism is.
The proximity of these cataclysmic events has made it easy to connect the stock market crash with the Great Depression that followed. But the origins of the Great Depression go back to the early 1920s and the societal upheavals and uncertainties following the trauma of World War I.
That's part of why the pit was so big, that there was so much of the froth of the 1920s wasn't actually really there. I always think of F. Scott Fitzgerald's writings, but he really captures the glitz and the glamour of the 1920s. But again, a lot of it was almost a dream, or it wasn't real, and that comes crashing down. Banks are very much a centerpiece of that, but it's far wider than just the financial system.
And though the Great Depression was not caused by the stock market crash, the poverty and suffering that followed made clear a sad reality. Throughout history, it is often the case that the ones who have the least suffer the most. This was also true of another notorious time in history. On the streets of Whitechapel, East London, between August and November 1888, a string of violent murders struck fear into the city, creating a legend that has swirled for over a century.
This murderer seemed to be killing without reason, without purpose, and almost everyone felt the fear and knew the terror.
A story so outlandish, so ghoulish, that one hoped it was solely entrenched in the world of fiction. Among the late-night fog rolling in from the Thames, under the dim, flickering gaslight of street lamps, and in narrow alleys and cobblestone streets across the East End, 5 women lost their lives in the most gruesome of circumstances. A series of notes from someone claiming to be the murderer were sent to the police, taunting them for not being able to capture him. He called himself Jack the Ripper. The murders and the fact that the murderer continued to elude the police created panic and hysteria.
Jack the Ripper was never caught. We don't actually know whether the person who was Jack the Ripper wrote the letters, but that's how he got his name.
So while we know women were brutally killed, until recently, the myth was that all of Jack's victims were prostitutes.
Sometimes it can be easier to make sense out of horrendous events if the victims don't seem entirely innocent. It's easy to say that a crime victim was, say, a sex worker, because that at least feels like it partially explains how they might have been in the circumstances in which they found themselves victimized.
While all 5 women had each struggled to make their way in a society where the odds were stacked against them, the truth is that only 2 had links to prostitution. The second victim, Annie Chapman, was homeless and sleeping on the streets when she was murdered.
There's also an element of sexism that says women shouldn't be out at certain times of night, or women shouldn't be engaging in certain kinds of behaviors like drinking or spending time alone with men in places that might be viewed as seedy.
The lurid claims about these women were a combination of social and gender-based prejudices, as well as the scurrilous reporting of the tabloid press. And while we may understand his victims better than we ever did before, Jack the Ripper was never caught, and his true identity is still a mystery.
We can start almost anywhere with the myths of Jack the Ripper. From Jack the Ripper being a doctor, to being a midwife, to being American crack, to being a painter, to being a policeman, to even famous detective.
Without hard facts, the void has been filled by self-proclaimed Ripperologists, generating various myths about the Ripper's true identity. The most titillating implied that he had to be a person of prominence, able to hide in plain sight. Chief among them, that he was a member of the royal family, specifically Queen Victoria's dissolute grandson, Prince Albert Victor.
I think the claim that Jack the Ripper could have been part of the royal family is really important to our analysis of what's going on behind conspiracy theories. So these murders, they were senseless events. And people like to think that they live in a world sort of guided by justice and some cosmic level. But this just seems nihilistic and purposeless. And so I think that when we attach horrific, seemingly purposeless events to more significant figures in history, it at least helps us with our good versus evil narrative.
It's human nature to want to answer a question. With the Royal Conspiracy, it can show that most have accepted that we're never going to know who Jack the Ripper was, but have twisted the question to ask why. Why are we never going to know who he was? Could it be that Jack the Ripper was an important man? And who would be more important in the Victorian times than the heir to the throne?
But for each theory, there is a counter-theory, keeping the myth and speculation alive and never getting closer to the actual truth.
We can't answer three major questions. We can't tell you for sure who he was. We can't tell you for sure how many people he killed. And because we can't answer those two questions, we can't tell you for sure why Jack killed. That leaves the door open for Jack the Ripper to be an nobody, but at the same time also have the ability to be anybody, because nobody can tell us that we're 100% right with a suspect. Perhaps more importantly, no one can tell us we're 100% wrong with a suspect, because when it all boils down to it, none of us was there at the time.
The Jack the Ripper story has captured our imagination, reinforced through countless representations in historical and fictional works. Looking back further, innocent women were the target of destructive myths long before Jack the Ripper skulked the alleyways of Whitechapel. The year was 1692. The place, Salem, Massachusetts. A group of young girls were afflicted by fits where they would writhe in pain, experience fevers, and make strange noises. The claim was that they had been accursed with witchcraft by other members of the small community. But did witchcraft in Salem actually exist? Encouraged by the church, the good people of Salem were terrified of the idea that the devil was trying to find ways to infiltrate and destroy the Christian community. In this environment, even the mere suggestion that witches were living in Salem triggered a frenzy of accusations, interrogations, and executions. And the myth of the Salem witches was born.
The Salem Witchcraft Trials could have begun because you have an isolated community, a very closed community, surrounded by hostile forces and heavily religious. And this repressive society is an absolute pressure cooker. And so the witchcraft trials in Salem begin because some teenage girls and some younger girls begin to accuse certain people of practicing witchcraft.
There's this frenzy that builds up around the accusations that these three young girls begin to level at people. No basis at all in fact or justice, but were driven forth by popular frenzy fed by these three young girls. And when I say they're girls, I mean, I think 11, 13, they're kind of pre-adolescent to on the cusp of adolescence. They are young people.
These young girls tapped into a communal fear in the hyper-religious young colony, giving their accusations of witchcraft an inordinate amount of weight.
For most of the people in Salem, the concern wasn't so much with the individual witch. The concern was, it was basically a conspiracy. The concern was, who are the other witches? The church was especially concerned about the loss of authority over people in Salem and the Puritans in general. So keep in mind, the Puritans were a very hardcore group of people. They did not handle dissent lightly. They were very concerned about making sure everyone was in order and keeping the group together and outside influences.
In Europe, centuries earlier, tens of thousands of people had been accused and killed for witchcraft. Believing something similar was happening in Massachusetts, the church moved quickly to cement its authority. The Salem Witch Trials took place between February 1692 and May 1693 and sparked a wave of myths and rumors in the region, some of which persist to this day.
There are several myths about the Salem Witch Trials. One of them is that if you're accused of being a witch, you would be killed as a witch. In the end, there were really only about 30 people that were found guilty and 19 people that were killed for it.
Another myth that persists is that the accused were all women.
Around about 78 to 80% of the people accused in Salem were women. But it's significant to stop and accept the fact that there is 20% of the others who were men. And men were tried as witches and executed along with women, not as many, but in addition to men, children were accused of witchcraft and executed. So while it is predominantly a women's history, we should never forget that saying it was only women is in fact a myth.
Hundreds of years later, the Salem Witch Trials live on as a vivid and horrifying event in history, depicted in popular culture as a symbol of how hysteria can quickly turn to violence. And while this is a story based on historical fact, the many myths of witchcraft continue to unravel. Women being burned at the stake as accused witches is a persistent part of the story. But these women didn't meet their end standing on a flaming pyre. Instead, they were hanged. The myth of witches burned at the stake possibly stems from the fact that it was used across Europe during the witch trials and executions that took place there as early as the 1400s and continued into the 18th century. Estimates of those executed in witch hunts in countries like Germany, Italy, and France number into the tens of thousands.
If you were executed for being a witch, chances are your body would have been burnt afterwards. And so this form of disposal of corpses by fire is also a contributing factor to the myth around the so-called burning times.
The Salem Witch Trials are an important moment in American history, but the inaccurate myths surrounding events in that small New England town are alive and well today for a core group of believers.
The story of Salem for American people is really integral to their history for many reasons, many of whom focus on Salem as a symbolic point of personal and spiritual reference, keep the myth alive because they want to point out the unfairness, the injustice of persecution of women and persecution of people believed to be practicing a certain type of magic or religious belief.
Part of the reason that the Salem Witch Trials were so evocative and compelling back then and remain so today is it was sort of this moral panic, social delusion, contagion. The Salem Witch Trials were basically an American version of things that have been going on in Europe for centuries. And it also exposed some of the underlying assumptions and basically fallacies about witches and witchcraft persecution.
Fast forward to the 20th century, and the persecution and misrepresentation of women is an ongoing discussion, as seen through the lens of the rise of feminism.
Speaker's Corner in London's Hyde Park has become the gathering place for members of the fair sex demonstrating against unfair treatment.
The notion of the bra-burning feminist has defined the women's liberation movement since the late 1960s. But how did this come to be? The story can be traced back to Atlantic City, New Jersey in 1968, and a group of women protesting the Miss America pageant. It was here that women from the fledgling feminist group New York Radical Women and others from around the country came to protest the staging of the Miss America pageant, an event that they believed was centered on the male gaze, putting women on a pedestal, competing for male approval, and that it perpetuated a degrading image of women.
I only hope that I can extend my own personality. I think that to some degree every Miss America wants to do her own thing, and whatever that may be, I hope that I can achieve it.
As a televised event watched by millions of people, this was the perfect place to launch the new era of the women's liberation movement.
It seemed like a no-brainer for feminists to protest at this event and point out that the opportunities for women weren't really being represented on a stage, which had to have you in a bikini in order to demonstrate why you were considered to be of national attention.
They brought placards and flyers to hand out, and a sheep that they crowned in a parody of the pageant. They also managed to get inside in a brief attempt to disrupt proceedings.
They had a trash can and women could deposit things that symbolically represented their repression into the trash can. So in went mops, in went bras, in went stilettos, in went fake eyelashes and a couple of copies of Playboy magazine.
Caricatured by the press, their efforts were trivialized and minimized in comparison to men who were protesting against the Vietnam draft. In actuality, the myth was created by a journalist for the New York Post who wanted to draw awareness to the feminist movement. She likened the burning of a draft card to the burning of a bra. But when her article went to print with the headline, "Bra Burners Plan Miss America Protest," it undermined the points she and the protesters were trying to highlight. In reality, they couldn't actually get a permit to start a fire on the wooden Atlantic City boardwalk. And yet, the bra-burning myth persists, with some modern feminists embracing the myth that continues to draw attention to the cause. Yet this myth wasn't the first or last misconception about the women's rights movement. Long before the 1968 pageant, there was the fight to gain women the right to vote, and through that, a more influential role in society. This was known as the women's suffrage movement.
The start of the suffrage movement in the UK began around about 1903 with Emily Pankhurst, who decided that she was going to take more direct action. It started through making posters, creating flyers, banners, doing protests, in an effort to see if they can raise more awareness for the women's cause and women's rights in the UK.
They were renowned for their public acts of protest, and in that sense they really broke down this very Victorian-inspired idea of how women should behave.
Just as the radical feminists of the 1960s were demonized by the media, so the suffragettes were often cast as militant extremists or as hysterical and irrational women. In reality, records of the UK-based movement show they were highly organized, courageous, and rational. They were based across 5 floors of an office building, with many departments dedicated to their operations.
The rise of the suffragettes and the suffragette period in the UK coincided with technological developments. So you could actually film them, you could actually photograph them, and it also coincided with the widespread popularity of the print media. The press usually captured them being dragged off to prison by the police or behaving outrageously.
Of course, depicting women as marching in the streets, wielding umbrellas, being violent and denying men an opportunity to have a say in the family because they wanted their way. This was how the media launched into this kind of idea of the women's suffragette.
And in 1913, at the world's most famous horse race, it came to a head. Emily Davison was believed to have killed herself to raise awareness of the suffrage movement. For decades, this tragic event was seen as an intentional protest. But in recent years, historians have revisited the evidence and determined that rather than committing a suicidal protest, Davison was actually attempting to tie a flag to the horse mid-race when she was struck down.
This situation was one that was regrettable since she and many other suffragettes had done similar stunts and even practiced such stunts. Tying scarves to horses or managing to get into the way of public events was one of the standard procedures that suffragettes would take on in order to demonstrate non-violent protest.
Generally, suffragettes held peaceful protests that were essential to the movement. This included refusing to pay taxes or to be counted in the census as a response to their lack of voice in society.
Women, black people, Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, and all the minorities, that all of us must stand up together and say, no more. This inhuman system of exploitation will change.
Whether or not you look favourably upon the idea of the bra-burning feminist as a myth or something that is to be looked up to and admired in terms of activism, well, that's up to you. But one thing it has definitely demonstrated to us is that organised activism, community voices, standing up for yourself is something that has great historical precedence.
Yet it was the violence and the more radical actions they took that were, and still are, associated with the movement. But perhaps this myth has had some positive influence in the wider community and shown how far women have been prepared to go to ensure fairness and equality in society.
The radicalness of the suffragettes really inspired second-wave feminism, which coincided with the sexual revolution and the human rights movement in the United States in the 1960s and 70s. And there you have these very, very militant women once again coming out to the streets and demanding access to control over their bodies, control over their finances, control over their sexual freedoms, and control over their careers and their educations. And like the suffragettes, they were inspired to theatrics. And that's where the myth of the man-hating radical feminist of the 1960s and 70s comes from, the myth of the bra-burning feminist, which in fact never really happened in that protest at all.
The contradictions in these stories add layers to the many myths that have marginalized women throughout the course of history.
At least now we know it's not nature, it's not biology, it's politics, it's unjust, and we've begun to change it.
Our faulty memory recall plays into many of the myths that prevail in our society, some of which distort our understanding of seminal events, while others can help us connect to a shared history.
As we develop, as societies change, as culture changes, myth, being incredibly flexible, will change along with it. Their messages are beautifully presented to us, and we can see our own interpretations in them. And they're eternal. We will always tell them.
We are drawn into fictions, exaggerations, and alternative facts, flowing into ever more compelling and seductive myths that we tell ourselves and each other over the course of time.